Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's for our distinguished webinar series in artificial intelligence cybersecurity. Today's talk is we have our distinguished speaker, Dr. Frank Monforte, and he's going to talk about two-stage ensemble smoothing of intraday load forecast in the presence of distributed solar PV generation. Dr. Frank Monforte is a senior forecast consultant at Itron, where he is an internationally recognized authority in the areas of real-time load and generation forecasting, retail portfolio forecasting, and long-term energy forecasting. Dr. Monforte's forecasting expertise includes authoring the load forecasting models used to support real-time system operations for the North American system operations for the California ISO, the New York ISO, the Midwest ISO, ERCOT, AESO, CENACE, and the IESO, and the Australian system operators, AEMO, and Western Power. Recent efforts include developing a framework for incorporating the impact of behind-the-meter solar PV generation on an operational load forecast. Dr. Monforte founded the annual ISO TSO Forecasting Summit that brings together ISO TSO forecasters from around the world to discuss forecasting challenges unique to their organizations. Dr. Monforte has co-authored award-winning publications on a range of problems, including the use of neural networks for short-term load forecasting, long-term end-use forecasting, and the use of nonlinear programming techniques for the development of least-cost gas supply and planning tool. Dr. Monforte received his BA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Frank, I'm so honored and thrilled to have you on this webinar, and thank you for accepting our invite, and we deeply appreciate your time and effort for this particular presentation, and the floor is yours. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, well, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Actually, I appreciate the opportunity to provide this type of presentation. Usually, my presentations are to the industry, and they're quite boring. But this kind of made me remember back my days when I was a grad student, and we used to show up at seminars after we had gone to the pub. So hopefully this one will be a little bit more memorable than some of the seminars I attended when I was a grad student. I have a pretty simple goal today. My goal is a couple goals. One is there are a lot of facets to ensuring the successful transition to a renewable-based generation. And what we do for a living in terms of operational forecasting is just one element of that transition, but it is an important part of that because with what we do, it helps operators run the grid as cheap as possible as they go through this transition to 100% renewable. So that's one thing I just kind of wanted to, there's a lot of ways that a lot of things we can do either directly or indirectly to help us with this transition to 100% renewables. The second thing is what I'm hoping is, if someone's out there and they see something that they could go, hey, I'd like to follow this a little bit more with my own research. If I can trigger some ideas or some thoughts on that, that'll be a win from my perspective. And if you do, I'm always available after the fact to discuss what I see is the current problem and possible avenues that could be support research going forward. All right, so let's get on with it. Okay, so abstract, because we always start with abstracts. Essentially, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you about the problem we have in one, I'm going to describe what operational load forecasting is. I'm going to describe how the mass penetration of rooftop solar PV, how that impacts what we do from a real-time load forecasting perspective. And then we're going to talk about a possible framework to help improve how we go about doing operational forecasting despite having lots of solar. So from our perspective, what we do is we make equations. That's our job. We think of variables, we create equations. And ultimately, all our equations are designed to tell a story. Because you have to explain why you put a feature variable or an explanatory variable in the model. You have to explain or convince yourself that that variable is doing what you expect. And so in order to do that, you need to have a story. So what I'm going to tell today is a story, and it's going to be all about operational load forecasting. So what is operational load forecasting? What you see on the screen here is one of the control rooms. This happens to be the control room for the California ISO. And for those who don't know, they manage the electricity from British Columbia down to Baja California and from the Pacific Ocean across to the Rocky Mountains. Where you're located, the Midwest ISO does something similar for them. ERCOT handles Texas, IESO and Alberta handle the sort of the Canadian components. Then you flow over to the East Coast and you have the New York ISO, ISO New England, PGM. So these are, in our industry, these are the big boys. These are the ones, you know, really at any given time. I think I broke this down, roughly 80% of all the electricity that flows through the wires in North America flows through one of our models. It's one or more of our models. Another thing to kind of think about, so what do they do in the control room? Their jobs are to pre-schedule generation. And so maybe that's on a day ahead basis, could be a 12-hour ahead basis, maybe even a couple hour ahead basis. And then within a, say in their case, about 1.5 hours out from now, they have to lock in all the generation that's going to be available for use to meet electricity demand over the next 5 minutes up to an hour and a half. So and how much generation they lock in or pre-schedule or pre-dispatch depends largely on the load forecasts that are produced. And that the square in a red square, that's we get one part of the whole grid, the big board. That's where our forecasts show up. Now, the big board is really for display purposes. It actually shows up on all these little screens. But at the end of the day, the more accurate our load forecasts are, the less amount of generation they need to pre-schedule, because they feel confident that when the time comes, they will have enough generation to meet the load that we're forecasting. Conversely, the less accurate we are, the more generation they need to pre-schedule to cover the uncertainty. And so it's kind of a hedging game. What we're finding is with rooftop solar, our forecast accuracy is starting to degrade. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but ultimately what that's having an impact in the control room is they're forced to schedule more generation, so big grid connected generation, to meet the increased forecast uncertainty. And so that's a $1 million type of problem. And we work very closely with all these companies. In fact, we work very closely not only with the North Americans, but also we have very similar systems in place in Australia. And Australia, when it all said and done, is kind of on the bleeding edge of dealing with the deep penetration of rooftop solar. So we have a lot of hands-on experience working with the system operators and their supporting forecasting groups. So just a little bit more to the story. In my world, in my life, I mean, I started way back when I was a grad student. The state of the art of computer power was an Apple I. And so this had floppy drives, and we would pass in floppy drives back and forth. And realistically, you were pretty limited by what you could do. Now, amazingly enough, I wrote a numerical optimization program using the Apple One. I think it would take to solve a problem, I would have to flip and flop floppies about 100 times in order to solve the whole thing, but that's kind of where we were. Back in those days, most of the grid operation forecasting was done on expert judgment. So people had been working in those control rooms for 30 plus years. They could look outside and decide, yeah, that looks like it was Tuesday from 2 weeks ago, and that's our forecast. As you progress through the 90s and 2000s, you had two things that kind of really exploded with around us. One was the proliferation of computing power. So now all of a sudden we could solve relatively large problems. There's also the proliferation of the internet, which made getting weather data automatically via internet connections plausible, where before we used to have to, get the newspaper and type in the numbers. With the internet, we could then progress to FTP. All right, so then also in this world, what happened is we kind of got introduced to this idea of neural networks. And that was mostly because the computing power was available to be able to solve them. Although with the original neural networks for load forecasting would take about 2 to 3 weeks to solve, as it did as back propagation. Clearly that wouldn't be an issue today, but they were sold, unfortunately, as magic black boxes. And that kind of, in a way, tainted, I think, the industry, because I think a lot of people said, "Oh, can't do load forecasting because it's a magic black box." And in reality, that wasn't really the case. It was just a technique. And ultimately, what matters is the variables that you put in there. But people got caught up in the technique and I kind of lost sight of what was really important, which was the explanatory variables. All right, now we're today. And today, everything's done in the cloud, massive amount of computing power. What that effectively means is we can now produce more numbers than we could possibly uniformly ingest and decide what to do. So we're still back to this world. Nothing is, in some respects, the one thing that hasn't changed through all of this is expert judgment. We still require expert judgment, still need native knowledge about the particular loads that you're forecasting. It is really hard to find a machine learning algorithm that can outcompete an expert who's knowledgeable about their particular loads. All right, now what does a load forecasting model look like? As I said, you were in the business of making equations. Way we do it is we do a cascade of models. So we'll start with, in this case, it's a neural network of daily energy, which is just think of that as the sum of the hourly loads. Why do we do that? When you average loads across time intervals in a day, you effectively smooth the data. And so you can get a very accurate forecast of daily energy and we use neural networks because when you look at daily energy, it's stable. And so neural networks, we tend to use neural networks when the loads are stable. So we'll do that for daily energy. That gives us a good prediction or a powerful prediction of what total energy will be for, say, tomorrow. We then feed that into, if we're doing sort of day ahead forecasting, into a set of regression models where in this case, we've got 30-minute data. So there'd be, 30, 2 times 24, 48 equations. If it was 5-minute data, it'd be 288 equations. If it was hourly, it'd be 24 equations. But one of the variables we would push into our day ahead forecast, the regressions, would be the predicted value from daily energy. So that's the cascade. Start with a forecast of daily energy, feed that into our day ahead models, which are predominantly weather and calendar condition driven. We do not include autoregressive loads in the day ahead models because we want those models to react quickly to changes in weather conditions. That's different than when we get into real time meaning 5 minutes ahead out, say 4 hours out. There, we want to include autoregressive turns because that syncs the forecast to where the current state of the load is. And typically that'll be done with a set of autoregressive terms. So this is load at noon. We're going to put into that model what the loads were at 11:30, 11, and 10:30. And all of this that I'm talking about, we have real-time data flowing in streaming, what they refer to as streaming every 5 minutes. So we know the current state of all the SCADA systems or the SCADA system every 5 minutes, which then means when we generate a forecast, which is literally every 5 minutes, so every 5 minutes during this talk, we're generating a forecast. We'll do a forecast for the next 5-minute interval out a rolling 14 days, all at the 5-minute level, using this cascade of models. And then there's, in fact, there's one other set that I didn't show here, which is we start with 5-minute level models that then blend over to these. So our job, again, is to build variables, build these equations. And we're trying to model a thing called load. So let's talk about what that is. So load is what the industry measures, as demand for power. Now, some things have changed that thing that we measure. COVID had, because there was more people working from home and less in, commercial facilities, industrial facilities, the HVAC, home-based HVAC, was more utilized, higher utilized during the week than it was pre-COVID. What we are seeing is there's a lingering effect because not everyone has gone back to the office. There's still a lingering effect of having additional weather sensitivity being driven by the residential sector post-COVID than we had pre-COVID. So we have this idea that all of a sudden, maybe a 80 to 85 degree day during the week would have lifted loads by maybe 200 megawatts. Well, now it might lift it by 250 megawatts because we have this additional residential cooling going on. Same thing on the space heating side. So we have, in essence, more HVAC equipment installed, ready to roll during the week than we used to have. What about climate change? Well, what we're starting to see, and I suspect where you've seen it as well, is it's manifesting itself as extreme temperatures, extreme cold, extreme heat. And what we are noticing is as people live through these sort of extreme weather events, it impacts how they think and how they utilize their HVAC equipment. In effect, people are becoming more what we would call weather sensitive. So they are more poised, more anxious about using their HVAC equipment, whether it's heating or cooling during these extreme events. But that also impacts non-extreme weather events because now all of a sudden we have more HVAC in place. So those two things we have to account for. We have to allow our equations to allow the weather slopes, the things that represent how much the utilization of HVAC equipment, we have to allow those slopes to evolve with these two types of events going on. Now, the other thing that's happening, and you'll probably be aware of this, there's been a huge amount of research money and private money thrown at forecasting grid connectable renewables, in particular grid wind generation, and then the big solar plants, more on the wind generation and solar plants. And that's been awesome. That's allowed more of that sort of grid connected generation to be brought on board and used by the systems. But the result of that is there has not been as much attention paid to distributed generation, so the rooftop solar. And what we're seeing is in particular in Australia, they are setting up market mechanisms to encourage people to start investing in rooftop solar. Well, you potentially are going to be at a point where you have more total kW of generation installed on people's homes than you have large scale grid connected generation. But we aren't spending as much time focused on how to accurately forecast that sort of distributed generation. So that's a challenge. And that's one of the, if there was a research topic, how to really forecast distributed generation, especially at a sort of micro geospatial level, would be a huge topic to chase after. And then the other thing, what happens with distributed solar generation and with pushing towards EV charging, the industry in general is saying, look, we need more than just a system load forecast. We need now a forecast down to a transformer. We need now forecasts down to individual premises. We need to know what is that rooftop solar unit at, you know, XYZ place. What is that going to do in the next 15 minutes? So there's this overwhelming push by the industry to push down the level at which we do our forecasting. So, you know, at some point we'll be probably not too far into the future, we will be producing 5-minute level forecasts every 5 minutes for 1 million plus premises. And that'll become the industry standard. And we're working on techniques for doing that, but that's where this is all going. All right, so what is it that we measure? In the old days, you know, what we measured was we have SCADA metering. We still have SCADA metering, but basically what SCADA metering says is we have a meter parked at every single large scale generation unit. So we know in any given 5-minute interval what each generation unit is pushing into the grid. We'll know any net exchanges. So if we're exchanging from this grid to a sister grid, we'll know what the net exchanges is. But what we could do is we could add up all the grid connected power, adjust for losses, and that what used to be our best measure of what demand for power was, consumption, actual consumption. And that would tie out to, you know, the individual premise metering, which would be collected, you know, once every month or two. So we had, before distributed generation, we had a really good handle on how consumption for power changed. And we had worked with engineers. We had really good, when we talk about variables in our equations, they were all based on engineering equations or engineering principles about how lights work and air conditioners and, you know, refrigerators, et cetera. So we had a really beautiful set of models. Now we move into this world of distributed generation. And the main thing to notice is on the far right, we don't measure what's happening behind the meter. So if you install a rooftop solar, what I see is the net outcome. I don't know really anymore how much you consumed because some of that consumption was supplied by your rooftop solar. So even though our SCADA metering keeps on doing what it's been doing, it is no longer a measure of power consumption. It is now becoming a measure of net load, which for all intents and purposes is the energy imbalance behind what's happening behind the meter, for which we do not have visibility. So all we see is the net outcome. So if you had rooftop solar, what I see coming out of your home is just either you're going to pull in more power because your solar didn't meet all of your needs, or you're pushing power onto the grid because you had more solar than you needed to consume. So we're seeing the net energy imbalance. So if you think about it, our forecasting problem has changed dramatically. It went from forecasting consumption, which we felt we had a really good handle on how people consume power throughout the day, to a net energy imbalance. It's like the difference between trying to model a sine wave versus white noise. And what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we untangle the white noise to get back to something that we used to know, which is modeling a sine wave. So energy imbalance modeling, incredibly difficult, especially if you don't see what's going on. What we're trying to do, and the whole point of this lecture, is to talk about how we can take what we are collecting, even though it's a net energy imbalance, how can we somehow turn that back into something we understand, which is consumption. All right, so just to give you a feel for how bad this is looking, in the upper left-hand corner, this is what a full commercial facility looked like before we did anything. Kind of the vertical, so this is each 5-minute interval of the day, that's the horizontal axis. The vertical bar for any given 5-minute interval represents 365 days of values. So it's 365 8 a.m. values. The range really just represents temperature. So air conditioning loads. And then there's also going to be a distinction between weekdays and weekends. But if you look at that, that is actually a relatively stable shape for which we could fit some easy models too. Down below is how that shape evolves. So this is a utility place where they have all their trucks. This is what that utility facility looked like after they converted all the fleet over to EVs. And so you see the nighttime charging, happening both on weekdays and weekends. And it kind of evolves from the shape above to the shape below. But again, if you look at that, you can kind of go, yeah, we can figure out how to model that. Feel pretty good. On the right-hand side is now our embedded solar and our embedded storage. So think of this as supply, but it's all supply that we don't see. So the net outcome between what solar generation is happening on this facility and anything they're doing with storage, any, whatever strategic direction they're using with storage, is leading to the middle picture. So the point is our models have to evolve from a picture of upper left-hand corner to now the middle picture. And you can just think about, if you did nothing more, probably a different set of variables are going to be required. For sure, any autoregressive terms are going to look different between the picture on the upper left and what's in the center. And those are kind of things now you have to kind of start considering if this becomes more and more the reality of what we're modeling. Okay, now this load masking, this idea that we don't really see what's going on behind the meter, is leading to the problem that this is the particular problem that we're trying to solve. So the red line on this chart, that represents net load. So that's what we get from our SCADA measurements. So all the big grid connected generation, less any net exchanges for other networks. What we're left over, what we're left over with is the red line. So that's our measure of demand, which is really net load, which is really essentially just an energy imbalance. Now, what I'm illustrating, the orange shaded area represents total rooftop, so behind the meter solar generation. And what you can see is as the generation starts kicking up, it carves into what we're measuring as net load. Now, the one thing to remember about an electric grid, the grid connected generation units will automatically back down or speed up to meet the demand. So in this case, as rooftop solar starts coming in, the grid connected generation starts backing down, and that's what results in the red line cascading down. Now, remember I said we produce a forecast every 5 minutes, and the initial set of forecasts are really launched off the most recent net load. So the rulers represent my highly sophisticated neural network model that I'm using for doing 12 period out forecasts. So if I think about it, the top ruler generates a forecast based on this top point right before solar kicks in. And what I really want to do is capture all the forecasts that I'm producing for the time period of around 6:30 at night. So that'll be in the blue box. And you can see what's happening is as the solar kicks in, our highly autoregressive forecast model, the ruler, keeps pointing to another forecast. And in fact, the volatility of what's happening in the morning is mimicking itself in volatility in what our forecast is for loads at 6:30 later that day. So this sort of forecast instability that's being driven purely by cloud movement in the morning is why utilities are forced to have to carry more generation for 6:30 at night, because we've increased this range of possible load conditions. And this range gets to be very expensive. So what we're trying to do is figure out how we can keep this range from being so wide and kind of come back to a more stable 6:30 p.m. forecast, and have the end, secondly, see if we can get that 6:30 p.m. forecast not to be a function of all the noise that's happening with cloud cover in the morning, right? It doesn't make sense. Yeah, it might have been really cloudy, might have even been stormy in the morning, but all that stuff blows away. And then in the afternoon, I get this night bright, beautiful day. Why is my 6 o'clock at night forecast looking like it was in the morning? And we want to get away from that. So what's really driving this, in addition to the thing we measure, is very volatile with solar, our historical framework for forecasting short term, within next 4 hours, 12 hours, leveraged lag loads, autoregressive terms. And that made a lot of sense when our load shape looked like the one on the left, nice and smooth and very consistent from one day to the other. So in other words, the relationship between loads at say 10:50 in the morning relative to say 10:30 or 10:45 or 10:40 would be relatively stable from one day over to the other. And so knowing actual loads through say 10:45, we could use this sort of stable autoregressive structure to come up with a pretty accurate forecast of what loads at 10:50 were going to be. And then we could chain that out through the rest of the day. But when you come over to a situation where you have a lot of rooftop solar, all of a sudden that relationship between loads at 10:45 and 10:50 breaks down. In fact, in this case, it goes from 10:50, maybe it's like, you take 10:45 times 1.1 to get to 10:50. Over here, you may take 10:45 and multiply by 0.8. And then on another day, you might multiply by 2, right? So all of a sudden, those autoregressive terms are working against us. All they're doing is they're taking the noise that happens with the cloud cover, chaining it through a set of autoregressive models, and that's what leads to the forecast instability in the evenings. So what do we do? What can we do? So there's two predominant approaches that we've tried. One is we call direct modeling. So in direct modeling, it looks, the f of x is all that stuff I put in before in our models, the day of the week and temperature conditions and holidays and all those lovely things. We then introduce as an explanatory variable or feature in our model our estimate of rooftop solar. And the idea is by putting solar in directly, we're freeing up the slopes on all their other variables. So our other variables don't have to explain this sort of change in the relationship between loads across time, as well as weather and all that stuff, by allowing the solar variable to be the explanatory power for all that. And then we can still include our autoregressive terms. So we did that. And it turned out that would have been awesome if we had true measure of rooftop solar, but we don't. We don't actually measure it. What we have at best is an engineering estimate that's based on some GHI forecast that we get from a weather service provider. So really what's going to happen when we drop our solar numbers here, it does help with the slopes on the other variables, but what it's really giving is a statistically adjusted estimate of rooftop solar. What we found, and we've had this in practice, once the rooftop solar penetration levels got beyond 10%, this started falling apart. And it was starting to fall apart because we did not actually measure solar. We had estimates, and those estimates were getting worse and worse as the penetration, as the population of rooftop solar grew. So we kind of went back to this idea of reconstituted load. Now, what is reconstituted load? So reconstituted load says, all right, let's take our measurement, the red line, let's add to it our best estimate of what the rooftop solar is. And then that gives us what we think our best estimate of demand for power. So the dark blue line. And so we've been down this approach. What this does is it forces you to make some strong assumptions. In particular, you have to make some assumption about what is the exact relationship that when you add in the solar. Is it 1 kW for 1 kW? Is it 0.8? You know, whatever it is, there's going to be potentially a fixed estimate of solar that you're adding back in. Okay, this helped with the stability of the autoregressive terms, because instead of trying to fit autoregressive terms to something that looks like the red line, fitting autoregressive terms to the dark blue line. But as you can see, adding back solar starts adding noise to the middle of my day. So let's think a little bit about how rooftop solar is forecasted. So there's two major approaches to this. One is numerical weather prediction models. These are best when you're 4 hours out. So these are the same models that do temperature forecasts and rain forecasts and all that stuff. It's usually typically based off, there's a European model, there's a North America model, and then those models get fed into your local weather service like AccuWeather, and then AccuWeather does their magic, and they sort of take the results that come out of those high level models and they make some adjustments, and bam, there's their forecast. Okay, for 4 hours plus, that's about as good as we're going to get, because that's the only source we have for predicting where clouds are going to be in cloud speed, wind speed, and cloud cover. For nearer term, so the idea is 15 minutes out to 4 hours ahead, there are companies that specialize in getting the satellite imagery. They then use, you know, classic cloud vector motion. They decompose it into 1 kilometer squares. They can compare one satellite image to the other. And then based on that, they can predict cloud cover movement, speed, and then given the density of the color of the 1 kilometer square, they can mathematically infer how much irradiance is hitting the ground. Okay, that's state of the art. There are a couple other approaches. There's sky cameras, relatively expensive, used in mostly academic worlds and/or for forecasting known solar plants. That's not, you know, there is some ground-based measurement, but they tend to be at weather stations, not really where the population of rooftop solar is. So no matter how you look at it, we're inferring how much irradiance is hitting my home based on probably the closest weather airport. That's kind of where we're at with rooftop solar in terms of its ability to forecast. So what that means is on cloudy days, so, when the satellite image is kind of covered, our estimates of rooftop solar, the errors associated with that grow. And those are exactly the days when we need more accurate estimates. But unfortunately, is those days that we have our worst estimates as well as our worst forecasts. On clear sunny days, they're pretty spot on. On super cloudy, dark days, they're pretty much spot on. But that's in between set of days, the errors are going and then go up. And then as the stock of rooftop PVs keep growing, that error just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so now all of a sudden I have an estimate of rooftop solar, especially on cloudy days, that is bouncing around because that's, the best they can do. When I add that into my net load, I'm just getting a reconstituted load that's bouncing around, which now all of a sudden is starting to make my reconstituted load models also get bad. So what can we do? So one of the things you have to make an observation, and the observation is temperature conditions that drive the dial on power consumption. So things that affect HVAC equipment tend to oscillate at a relatively slower frequency than rooftop solar. Rooftop solar can bounce 1 minute to the next, but HVAC, that's going to take an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. So it tends to run smoother, slower. And the same thing with other things with consumption. If you look at the aggregate load shape across a whole bunch of homes, it is a very smooth, slowly evolving shape. But clearly not the case with cloud cover moving around. So what happens is when we add back to really fundamentally is a relatively smooth load shape, add to it a very noisy, potentially very noisy solar generation shape, we can start thinking about, are there ways to isolate the noise that comes from the errors associated with the rooftop solar? I still want the basic idea that, maybe I'm using 60% of my rooftop solar today, but it might be bouncing between 40% and 80% up and down, but on average, it's about 60%. So I want that 60% to get added into my net load to come to a reconstituted load. But all that noise, I want to get rid of it because that noise hurts my reconstituted load models. So if you look at the field of signal processing, and this is part of one of the other parts of my talk, was there's a lot you can learn from other fields of study and then bring forward those tools into what your particular thing you're doing. So from a perspective of load forecasting, we'd leverage everybody. We're not shy or bashful about using techniques and ideas from other fields of science. The challenge is you have to get past the language barrier. Every field of science has its own set of languages, but if you kind of sit and you work with it a little bit, you'll start realizing, oh, we used to call that regression. They call that Fourier transforms, and you just kind of figure it out. But there's some really good ideas in other fields. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to use from signal processing a way of smoothing through the solar. So the one in particular process we like is the thing, these Savasky and Golay smoothing filters. All it is a standard moving average, but the weights are based on some polynomial form. Why do we like that? If you just did a straight standard moving average and you applied that to a load shape, you're going to get a really flat load shape. What we want to do is preserve as much as possible the nuance of the load shape. And so we do the Savasky Golays. So we do all that. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump ahead. We apply multiple size windows, 25 to 9 to 5. We then apply that all to the solar. We then compare each smoother so each window to clear sky, the second order derivatives. And what we're looking for is we want to weight the one smoother that is close to, that gives me is as smooth as clear sky. Once we know what the relative weights are for each of the windows, we then apply those same smoothing windows to the reconstituted loads. So on a really cloudy day where it's bouncing around, we'll favor a longer or wider window. That'll get rid of the noise from the cloud. On less cloudy days or clear sky days, we'll favor much thinner or not as wide windows, so we keep on the actual nuances of the loads and not worrying about the additional noise that comes from the solar. So that's the two steps. So we're going to save reconstituted load by smoothing through and eliminating sort of the noise from the solar that we're adding back. That gives us, we can maintain our autoregressive solutions, still maintain our demand models, and produce a stable sequence of forecasts. And then the next problem for you to think about, this happens in South Australia. There are days when they have so much rooftop solar that what they measure as net load goes negative. And that becomes another problem unto itself. So let me stop here. I'm sorry, I kind of ran a little long with my time. And if there are any questions?
You can continue for 5 minutes if you think if that helps.
Okay, well, let me so I'm going to just throw out one more slide. This is just for, mostly for the grad students. You know, a couple things to kind of think about. I was thinking about this, about my own career. You know, the tools, the hardware in particular, the computer power you work with is going to change vastly over the years. And that certainly has been true with me. I mean, I effectively, my career was based on the growth of personal computing. But what I have found is most of the techniques and most of the mathematical ideas that we leverage are from people like George Danzig and Clive Granger, who did all their work pre-mass computing. So they gave all the thought to how to do things. We just have the fortune of having the computers to do lots and lots of stuff. I have also found in my career that Excel, the internet, and willingness to learn other techniques from other disciplines makes a huge difference. Why do I like Excel? Excel, because you can look at the data, you can key up any particular algorithm, and that allows you to understand what you're really modeling, what your models are intended to do. Otherwise, it just becomes a black box, and anyone can run a black box, but it's understanding what that black box is doing and the variables that need to go in there. That's the real art to modeling. The internet is awesome because, man, you can find so much information. It's ridiculous. When I was a grad student, if I had access to the internet, I could have done my thesis in half the time. And then the last bit about I've been very fortunate in my career. I've worked with some brilliant people. I got to work with George Danzig. I got to work with Clive Granger. I mean, these are giants in their fields. But because of that, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about constrained and unconstrained optimization, signal processing, econometrics, decision trees. All those things just make you a better carpenter. Having more techniques available that you understand are great. And finally, this is my ode to John Henry. And this will sound, I don't know, conceited, but the bottom line is I've yet to find any machine learning algorithm, that beats a well-specified model that took a lot of hard work and a lot of hard thinking. So, you know, machine learning are wonderful, but they're not the solution. It's still the person who's modeling is really the solution. And the last thing I'll just kind of leave you with, beware of correlation, because it's not always causation. The fact that the sun rises in the sky the fact that my solar panels produce more electricity when the sun is in the sky does not mean my solar panels cause the sun to rise. But correlation would make that seem like it was true. So you have to be careful about correlation and causation. Okay, I am complete.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frank. That was a very insightful talk. I'm glad you brought Professor George Danzig. I have not met him, but I studied a lot of his decomposition models, so very, it's just a powerful book that, I cherished during my dissertation thing. I really enjoyed reading his work, and you're right. I think sometimes it's going back what this, the thoughts are already laid out. You just need to make sure that you understand that and put together a good feature set for your models. Anyway, let's see if we have any questions. Nirup, do you see any questions? Or if not, maybe I'll start with the, you talked about this reconstituted load and we only focused on solar, but how do you see as we get more and more other distributed generation comes up, probably you suggest people should look at ensemble forecasting by, following, similar approach, what you talk about to understand this, it's going to be very more complex. So you're saying net load is negative for Australia. So, we probably at some point we may reach something like that, right? So how do you see as more and more DERs are being added to the grid, distributed generation, and people are now thinking about DERMS and see, what that software solution may look like. And I don't know, could you, because you talked about, I think you did give some advice to students about geospatial forecast, in your early slides, what do you mean by that micro geospatial forecast? Do you mean by at a very at a city level, some kind of could you shed some light to see how especially when you can't see the behind the meter reading, in terms of what do we do?
Yeah, so turns out that in fact we're right in the middle of doing this in Australia. So let me tee up what the Australians are thinking about. So the Australians had this idea that they want to encourage via a market greater penetration of rooftop solar and storage, whatever, and distributed energy resources, right? And the way they're going to do that is they want to create a market, and the market in principle will give you financial incentives. So for example, I installed a 4 kW system on my house. If I had the right financial incentives, I might have installed a 10 kW, knowing that on any given day, I might have 6 kW of power I could sell and get paid for. And so what they're trying to do is set up a market that would achieve that sort of financial incentives. Now, the challenge with that is the low voltage network. So this is down to an individual premise, like a home or a neighborhood. The transformer can only take so much reverse flow. So in particular, on those days that they've noticed, and it's typically in the spring when there's not a lot of HVAC because it's mild but very sunny and solar is at its max, there's more flow, reverse flow, than the transformers can take, and they have to black out the neighborhoods. So what they want to do is to account, they still want to incent people to put excess capacity in, but what they're going to do is they're going to give them dynamic operating envelopes. So there's going to be some days they're going to simply say, I don't care, you got to turn your solar inverter off because there isn't enough room to backflow. But other days, I don't care. You could generate 10 kW and push all of it onto the grid because the transformer will have capacity for it. So what's happening there is to come up with these dynamic operating limits, which by the way are at the 5-minute level for rolling 48 hours. We're literally forecasting the net load at each premise. So if there's 1 million premises, then we're producing 1 million forecasts every 5 minutes. Those forecasts also leverage forecasts of what the rooftop solar is doing. So the challenge, and this is where so now we're talking about, I may know how much solar capacity has been installed in the neighborhood. So think about where you live. I'll know every house that's had rooftop solar. 48 hours from now, I need to know where the cloud's going to be on that neighborhood. None of the technology, the numerical weather predictions, nor the satellite decomposition can do that for me. So even if I'm talking 1 hour out and I have my satellite decomposition, that is still way too high, too gross of a level to say what is happening in this neighborhood. So one of the things we're looking at is, how do you leverage either real-time measurement on some of the rooftop solar units in a neighborhood, use that as a sample for what's going to happen for the other ones, or is there some neighborhood specific measurement that you could install, collect that in real time? So let's say I can put on a street light an irradiance collector. Can I use that irradiance collector to predict movement of cloud cover in this particular neighborhood? So that's the level at which we're working. And that level of detail is where the industry is going. So it is trying to do the impossible. We're trying to predict individual customer homes. You won't be able to do it. I can tell you right now, 100% you'll be wrong. But can you do it and come up with a reasonable upper and lower bound for each premise so you can look at what the total impact is on a transformer? I think we can do that, but that's going to require a lot of research.
Right. We have some questions. I think it's not me asking this. Looks like they shared they're using my Zoom link. So the questions is for for Ensemble prediction, whether the prediction is to estimate the real demand under sudden loss of PV generation.
So a lot of our ISO clients are moving to Ensemble forecasting, and the ensembles are made up of two different things. One is different load forecast models, maybe autoregressive, maybe not autoregressive, could be different specifications. But the other ensemble, the weather service providers currently produce a single point forecast, but that single point forecast is really a weighted average of 10 or more scenario forecasts. And so what they're doing is they are working with the weather service providers to ingest all the scenario forecasts, run each scenario forecast through the load forecast. That then gives you multiple alternative load forecasts. And then again, and that quantifies then the load forecast uncertainty, right? It's a different way of building confidence intervals by just running the main thing that you're uncertain about, which is weather, through your models. And then I think what's going to happen, this is just pure conjecture on my part, the industry will start migrating towards a more risk assessment type modeling, right? The industry is very engineering based. So here's the number and this is the best we can do. I think they're going to start moving more towards, well, that's a number, but the range is this. How do we hedge against the range?
Good. The next question is, when electricity storage is involved, how the ensemble prediction will be affected?
Okay, so two types of storage. There's grid connected storage, and then there's behind the meter storage. The grid connected storage, for the most part, what we've seen today, has been used to provide frequency control, for the low voltage, and they'll probably still do that. At some point, I wouldn't be too surprised you'll start seeing storage connected directly to wind and solar, so they can dispatch that generation, at non-daylight times. Behind the meter is totally different, right? Because now all of a sudden, what we're trying to do is guess why someone is using their storage. If it's price related, then you have to kind of guess what their price response is, their price elasticity, and that'll be different by different customers. It's going to be different by different days. So once we get behind the meter behind the meter storage involved, that makes this energy imbalance problem potentially even worse.
Great. Since there are a lot of graduate students listening to this talk, what advice do you have for them to, as they deciding choosing the thesis or dissertation topics? Do you have any recommendations on any particular open source data sets, whether it's behind the meter or whatever that you think, maybe for them to explore, that people haven't looked into? Do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, if there is an interest there, what reach out to me, and then I can connect you with one or more of the ISOs. I mean, if you're really interested in the rooftop solar, I'll introduce you to either the California ISO or the Australians. The Australians had the problem in spades. California is coming next, but they can share historical data and stuff. Just bear in mind, there's one thing to do something retroactively. It's a whole other thing to be producing a forecast every 5 minutes.
Great. Any other questions, Nirup? Do you see any other questions?
No, I think we're clear.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just stop here, I think, in the interest of time. So thank you, Dr. Frank, for your presentation. It was very insightful, and we will, let me see the question.
Okay. Hello, can I ask a question?
Yes, Dr. Jun Lu. Yes, go.
Okay. So let me ask, a question. I want to know that, from the research, the solution approach perspective, I want to know that, whether the power company prefers, the suggestion that, if some, the energy storage gets deployed somehow, certainly not, for frequency control purposes, it's actually deployed, somewhere, just, somewhere, just, in the community. And however, the power company also will be able to have the control to decide when to charge or discharge of those kind of, the community energy storage, whether, consideration is a kind of, will be supported, or the power company will even reject of that, suggestion.
No, I think what's going to matter is whether there is a market mechanism whereby the company that is going to upfront the investment on the community storage, if there's a market mechanism that they can get paid for doing that, I think that's where that ultimately is what's going to drive it. So there are different regions of the US and the world provide markets for storage, grid connected storage. So that's going to be the answer, is just you have to kind of find where they're taking bids for someone to install grid connected storage. And in which case, then that'll be the place where it's going to show up. So like in San Diego, we have a 40 megawatt storage battery based system, and the money they make is off allowing the utility to use it for frequency control. So they somehow built that into the bid when they put in the storage. So yes, that's definitely out there, and there are a number of commercial companies that are pushing pretty hard on doing storage, grid connected storage. The behind the meter is a little bit different, right? That kind of storage is expensive. Last I looked at, it's going to cost somewhere between $7,000 to $14,000 for me to put a battery in my house, and I just couldn't justify it. It's just, that's a pretty big get. So when the battery storage behind the meter comes down in price, then that'll be different, but it's still pretty pricey at this point.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frank and Jin Liu, for the questions. I think with this, we'll wrap up our session. And again, we appreciate Dr. Frank's time. And thank you, Dr. Frank. We'll be sending you a nice plaque for your contribution towards the webinar series. And we appreciate again, sincerely, the effort.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.